Chapter 9. Evolution of the two instincts in the individual. I have now shown that all the emotions of the soul of man have their origin in two correlative instincts, namely, the instinct of self-preservation and the evolutionary or altruistic instinct. I have pointed out the fact that under normal conditions the two are harmoniously interrelated, but that under abnormal conditions either faculty may obtain undue ascendancy, even to the total submergence of the other. I have shown that, normally, the instinct of self-preservation is conservative and preservative, that it is promotive of a due regard for existing conditions, personal safety, and private rights, but that, abnormally developed, it leads to pure selfishness and a total disregard of the rights of others. On the other hand, the evolutionary instinct, normally developed, is creative, progressive, and altruistic, altruism predominating. Abnormal development leads to a chronic dissatisfaction with existing institutions and to imbecile schemes for reforming them, to hysterical sympathy for criminals whose crimes are of exceptional atrocity, to suicide for the purpose of enabling one's family to realize on his life insurance, in short, to unreasoning and unrestrained excitation of the sympathetic emotions. I have shown that between the extremes of selfishness and altruism there exists a wide battlefield for the contending emotions, that the conflict between them is incident to the transitional stage of development from primitive savagery to an ideal civilization. It is the great body of mental phenomena incident to this transitional stage that furnishes forth the pique de resistance for all the feast of reason with which philosophers and metaphysicians have been wont to regale mankind. I shall not enter that field at present except for the purpose of a brief inquiry with a special reference to the influence of the brain-mind, or objective mind, upon the development and regulation of the two instincts which we have been considering. I have already endeavored to show that the brain is simply a highly specialized physical organ, especially adapted to the exigencies of a physical environment, and that it was developed in response to the growing necessities of animal life, just as, under other conditions, weapons of offensive and defensive warfare were developed. I have shown that the brain performed its functions largely by the process of developing secondary instincts, that it was constantly stimulated to increased efficiency by contact with ever-increasing complexities of constantly changing environmental conditions, and that it thus became in man the dominating factor in the dual mental organism. I shall now attempt to show that man's mental, moral, spiritual, and social development is brought about by precisely the same agencies, operating by the same processes that developed animal intelligence after the brain became a factor in mental evolution. There are differences, of course, but they are of degree, proportion, and subject matter. That is to say, there is a difference of degree in the development of the objective mind, there is a difference in the proportional development of the two minds, and there is a difference in subject matter in that the environmental conditions, which stimulate the growth and progressive development of man, are largely of a moral, intellectual, and spiritual nature. But the processes are fundamentally identical. Thus, when an animal is confronted by a new environment, involving new problems of subsistence and new dangers to be encountered, its inherited instincts are at fault, and hence it acts intelligently, as the naturalists say. That is, it reasons out the problems presented and acts accordingly. In other words, the objective, or brain, intelligence performs its functions and directs a line of conduct adapted to the exigencies of the case. Then, if the conditions are permanent, the intelligent act becomes habitual, and finally, after being performed for several generations, it is converted into a permanent instinct, and is thereafter inherited. When new problems are presented to man, the process and the result are the same. For instance, a question involving the principles of right and wrong presents itself to the objective, or reasoning, mind. It may be a question involving the personal welfare of the individual, or it may involve his emotional nature. It may be a question of religious duty, or it may involve his obligations to his family, the community in which he resides, or the state which claims his allegiance. In either case, there may be conflicting interests, emotions, or passions to reconcile, regulate, or restrain. The untrained passions of the animal or the primitive man, with correspondingly feeble reasoning powers, would quickly decide in favor of sensual gratification, unless restrained by an obviously imminent danger. But the man whose reason is trained and developed may yet be beset by strong emotions, passions, interests, or desires that conflict with what reason prescribes as a duty to himself, to humanity, or to God. Then ensues the great conflict of which Paul complains, the law and his members' two instincts in the individual, L8L warring against the law of his mind. Every normal man is called upon to experience this warfare between duty and desire, between right and wrong. Normally conducted, it is a conflict, not for the destruction of the emotional nature of man, not for the elimination of the passional element from his soul, but for the regulation, elevation, and purification of that element and directing it into legitimate channels of normal activity. It is the office of reason, the function of the objective mind, to decide the contest, and just in proportion to the relative strength of the reasoning powers as compared with that of man's selfish emotions, will the decision be on the side of right as against wrong. Reason, therefore, is the judicial tribunal of the soul, and when its decision is made in any case of conflict, a course of conduct is entered upon in accordance with that decision. And it is the aggregate of these decisions that constitutes the character of the individual. Whatever the course may be, when it becomes habitual, and when it is persisted in for a few generations, it is converted into an instinct and is then inherited. In other words, another secondary instinct is thus created, which adds its quota to the sum of the faculties of the subjective mind. It must not be forgotten, in this connection, that while the objective mind is cold and emotionless, as becomes its judicial function, it is, and has been from the beginning, identified in its judicial capacity with the instincts of self-preservation and appetency, or the evolutionary instinct. As we have already seen, it is the source of secondary instincts alike in animals and in man. That it is the source of all progress in the sciences and the appliances of civilization is a matter of common observation. It follows that its constant aim is to do the very best it can for the preservation and progress of humanity. Its judgment may sometimes be wrong, but that it is generally right is evidenced by the giant strides which civilization has made since Bacon formulated the function of the brain and reduced its process of reasoning to a system. Nor must it be forgotten that this judicial tribunal of the dual mental organism is not destitute of an executive agency to enforce its decrees. That agency is what is known to science as the law of suggestion. The power of suggestion is the most potent mental energy with which man is endowed. Its influence is felt in every department of human activity. It is the instrumentality of universal education. It is the power that invests man with dominion over all sentient creatures. It is, in short, the instrumentality through which the mind of reason is enabled to educate and discipline the soul for weal or woe in this world and the world to come. I repeat, therefore, that the objective mind, the mind of which the sole function is that of inductive reasoning, is the judicial tribunal, the court of oyer and terminer, which hears and determines all questions pertaining to the welfare of man in this life. When properly cultivated, it sits in judgment upon every act of our lives, regulates every emotion, restrains every passion, and directs it into legitimate channels. In short, it is at once the tenure by which man holds his free moral agency and the power that enables him to fit his soul for eternity. But, as before remarked, an agency was necessary to enforce the decrees of the tribunal of reason upon the mind of the soul. This was rendered possible by the limitations of the subjective faculties. This limitation, as I have before pointed out, consists of the absence of inductive power in the subjective mind. It was, indeed, this limitation that rendered a brain necessary as a part of the physical organism, and under the law of appetency it was this necessity that impelled its development. When the brain was developed, it swayed the dominant mental energy by virtue of its power to reason, and its consequent ability to take the initiative in those intelligent actions that were rendered necessary from time to time in consequence of constantly increasing complexities of environment. The subjective minds of the lower animals were therefore dominated by the suggestions of their objective minds, precisely as the subjective mind of man is now controlled. In fact, the supremacy of suggestion was even more perfect, theoretically at least, with animals than with men, for the reason that all intelligence in animals pertains to self-preservation and evolution. The objective intelligence therefore ministered to the wants and necessities and propensities of animal nature just the same as it contributed to its safety. But with man it is different. Questions of morality, ethics, and religion occupy man's attention, and require the restraint or regulation of the animal propensities. Hence it is that the control by the power of suggestion is not so easy and certain in man as it is in animals. Nevertheless, the subjective mind of man is limited by the same absence of inductive powers, and the law of suggestion prevails. Hence the frequent contest for supremacy between the two minds, the mind of reason and the mind of emotion, the mind of judgment and the mind of passion. It may be here remarked that this contest has been experienced by every normal man and every normal woman of mature years. It is the one phenomenal manifestation of duality of mind that is experienced under normal conditions by everybody. The other faculties of the subjective mind are less in evidence. The purely intellectual faculties, for instance, rarely appear above the threshold of normal consciousness. They sometimes appear in cases of genius, but as Lombroso, one more clearly than anyone else, has pointed out, genius itself is intensely abnormal. The same may be said of the faculties of telepathy and telekinesis, modified only by the character of the manifestations in the nature of the abnormality. But the emotions are constantly near the surface, so much so, indeed, that some of those who adhere to the dual hypothesis are inclined to the opinion that the objective mind itself is endowed with emotional faculties. This, however, is an error that will be made obvious by a moment's consideration of the salient facts. Thus, to locate the emotions in the reasoning mind would be to handicap it with that which would limit if it did not destroy its judicial independence, this, on the principle of adaptation of function to purpose which prevails in all nature, would be a sufficient reason for keeping the judicial mind free from the influence of selfish emotions. This, however, is merely a reason why the emotions should not be located in the reasoning mind. But it should not be forgotten that, in all of nature's laws, that which should not be is not, and that which should be is. We may rest assured, therefore, on a priori grounds, that nature's mental tribunal, which was so obviously instituted for the purpose of providing a guide and a mentor for the body and the soul in their journey through the dangers and temptations of earthly existence, is not handicapped by faculties that would preclude the possibility of a dispassionate performance of its functions. The facts bearing upon the question are many, prominent among which are these. The crucial fact is that the emotional faculties antedated the brain by many millions of years. And since no member of the old school of psychology has been able to tell us when or by what process they were transferred to the new organ, we are justified in assuming, on a priori grounds, that the transfer has never been made. Logically, therefore, we have a right to hold that position until the contrary has been demonstrated, or at least until such a posteriori reasons are advanced as will show the position to be untenable. But it happens that the latter all conspire to sustain the position. For instance, the warring of the parts, from the agonies of which St. Paul prayed to be delivered, or the conflict between reason and passion of which we have already spoken, presents indubitable evidence that two distinct mental organisms, actuated by antagonistic motives, are testing for supremacy. Again, the facts of suggestion demonstrate the principle of duality. Thus, normally the brain mind, or objective mind, controls the subjective mind, including the emotions, just in proportion to the comparative development of the two. But when the action of the brain is inhibited, as in hypnotism, the emotions can be controlled by the suggestions of another. And this may be done even against reason, experience, or the evidences of the senses. The only exception to this rule is when the suggestions conflict with conscience. Of this more will be said hereinafter. Now, the fact that the emotions can be controlled by suggestion under any circumstances so far as to nullify the facts of experience is indubitable evidence that they belong to the subjective mind. And when to this is added the correlative fact that the reasoning, or objective, mind is not and cannot be so controlled, but that, on the contrary, it normally has the power to control the subjective mind by suggestion, we have an overwhelming array of evidence that the two minds are distinct organisms, possessing independent powers, operating by diverse methods and differentiated by distinctive limitations. It will now be seen that in the great conflict between evil and good, in the great struggle between right and wrong, man is not handicapped by a preponderance of evil in his nature. On the contrary, the strongest instinct of his soul impels him forward in the path of progress toward a realization of the highest ideals of the Master, and reason is on the side of right. In this connection, it has often been asked why it is that the subjective mind, the mind of the immortal soul, is subordinated to the mind that perishes, why it is that it is limited in its reasoning powers, why it is dominated and constantly controlled by the power of suggestion. These are pertinent and far-reaching questions, and if they could not be answered clearly and definitely, and the methods of control and the processes of training and development clearly pointed out, the hypothesis would be unworthy of a moment's serious consideration. In attempting a reply to these questions, we must premise that, the foundation having been laid by the facts and arguments in the foregoing chapters, what follows will be largely in the nature of a statement of conclusions. In the first place, it must be remarked that, since God's method of creation is by a process of progressive development in accordance with an immutable law, and since it is evident that man is the final goal of organic evolution, it follows that the potentialities of manhood were necessarily inherent in his primordial ancestry. That is to say, every essential faculty of the subjective mind of man existed, inchoate and potential, in the mind of the lowest unicellular organism, and after the brain was evolved, every faculty, objective and subjective, that man possesses thus existed in all his ancestry that were endowed with brain faculties. No evolutionist will gainsay this proposition, for it is the essential implication of the evolutionary hypothesis. It follows that all the animal passions and propensities are the inalienable hereditaments of man. After what has been said in preceding chapters, however, the statement will not seem so shocking as the words might seem to indicate, for it is now evident that what we have been in the habit of stigmatizing as the lowest instincts of animals is primordial altruism, and that these same instincts, when normally developed, refined, purified, elevated, and directed by an enlightened conscience into legitimate channels in man, are converted into the noblest impulses, and are promotive of the highest and purest altruistic devotion of which the souls of men are capable. Man need not, therefore, be ashamed of the mental attributes of his humble ancestors, since his noblest faculties were inherited from them, and the quality, character, and value of the heritage depend upon his own volition, depend upon the use he makes of it. The parable of the talents is directly in point, and it is one of the finest illustrations of the wisdom of the master that have been handed down to us. Here, then, we have two facts to correlate. The first is the fact that the faculties possessed by man existed, inchoate, in the lower animals. The second is that the subjective mind of each is limited by the law of suggestion, or, what is an equivalent statement, it is incapable of inductive reasoning. Now, the first explanation that the inquirer will demand is, why is the subjective mind thus limited in its powers? To that question, only a provisional answer can be made in this immediate connection, namely, that it appears to be because the subjective mind or entity was designed for a higher ultimate destiny, and hence only such faculties were given to it as would be useful in that higher plane of existence. Hence inductive powers were not given to it, for the reason that such a faculty would be useless to a being who is endowed with the power of intuitive perception of the laws of its being, or, in other words, of all essential truth pertaining to its state of existence. I have, however, touched upon this topic in earlier chapters of this book, and have treated it more fully elsewhere. Point 1. It is reiterated here only for the purpose of making the present statement complete. Be the reasons what they may, the facts remain as stated, namely, 1. That man inherited all his faculties, passions, and propensities from the lower animals, and 2. That the subjective mind is, and always has been, controlled by the suggestions of the objective mind. Now, this control was easy and without friction so long as the whole energies of the dual mind were absorbed in providing for the necessities and avoiding the dangers incident to a purely animal existence. But when man appeared, and when, in the process of development, he emerged from a state of primitive savagery, he gradually became conscious of the fact that his environment was no longer purely physical. In other words, he gradually became conscious of his status as a moral being, having duties to perform toward his fellow men. With that came a sense of dependence upon some higher power, together with a sense of duty or obligation to that higher power. In short, the time came when it was necessary to restrain and control the animal passions and propensities in deference to the rights of others. And it was then that the wisdom of investing the objective mind with the power to control those passions and to direct their exercise and development became manifest. In other words, it was then that the utility of the law of suggestion was demonstrated, for that is the law by virtue of which reason became normally the dominating power of the duplex mental organism. That is the law under the provisions of which mortal man was made a free moral agent, for it invests him with full power to train his soul for weal or woe for this world and the world to come. The process by which this training is accomplished is precisely the same in man as secondary instincts were acquired by the lower animals after a brain had been evolved and become a part of the mental equipment of sentient creatures. That is to say, the instincts of self-preservation and appetency together constitute the primary impulse which actuates man substantially as it did the lower animals. The objective mind, now as then, reasons out the problems of life as they are presented and decides upon the best course to pursue. And the subjective mind accepts the suggestion, acts upon it, and in due time the course of conduct becomes habitual, then instinctive and inheritable. Thus, the objective mind is purely utilitarian, and being devoid of emotion, it coldly reasons out the problems as they are presented, but always with an eye single to the question of benefit to the individual or the species. The subjective mind, on the other hand, accepts the utilitarian suggestion, and when the course of conduct once becomes instinctive, or, in other words, firmly fixed in the subjective mind, the impulse to carry it out is converted into an emotion, or a moral principle, or both, according to the nature of the action.